This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Welcome to today's meeting of the Planning and Regeneration Committee. Members of the public may like to follow @London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag Assembly Planning for this meeting. Please may I remind everyone to switch phones to silent mode and to ask that members and guests ensure that electronic devices are not placed in front of their microphones. Before we begin, I would like to inform you that Assembly Member Moema has resigned as the Deputy Chair of the Planning and Regeneration Committee. She will remain a member of the committee. The full Assembly will elect a Deputy Chair of the committee to serve for the remainder of the year in due course. Today we are holding an investigation on social value in planning and regeneration, but unfortunately, if you just, our guests can just be patient with us. We've just got a couple of items that we have to deal with first, so thank you. Can I ask our committee clerk, Saz Fazal, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received from Assembly Member Moema, for whom Assembly Member Hirani is attending as a substitute.
Thank you, and you're welcome. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? Noted. No other interests. Always take a pause for that one. Before we approve the minutes, I just wanted to it's been brought to my attention that we need to do a slight change in the public draft to include Assembly Member Wilson as an observer. Apart from that, can we, those minutes are accurate. So can we confirm the minutes of the committee meeting held on the 9th of September 2024? Agreed. Can we note the completed, closed and ongoing actions arising from the committee's previous meetings and the additional correspondence sent and received? Thank you. Can we note the response from the Mayor to the committee's report, Retrofit versus Rebuild? Thank you. Now, item 6. We now move on to our main item of business for today. A discussion with 2 panels of experts on the concept of social value in planning and regeneration. I'd like to welcome our first panel of guests, who are Tony Burton, CBE, where's that end? Right. Tony Burton, CBE, the founder of Civic Voice and an urban planner. Stephanie Edwards, who is the co-founding director of Urban Symbiotics. We have Mafanwi Taylor, who is a lecturer in urban economies and planning at the Bartlett School of Planning, University College London. Guy Battle, who is the founder and chief executive officer of the Social Value Portal. And Maria Adebowole Schwartz, the Commissioner for London's Sustainable Development Commission and the Director of the Living Space Project. So if we can now go to our first question, which I shall ask once I can find it, which shouldn't be too long. Can I start with how can the design of a public place help to deliver social value? Perhaps if we can go to Miss Edwards first.
Thank you for having me here today. My name's Stephanie Edwards, as you know. Our company, Urban Symbiotics, is really focused on delivering social value through design, but also really through a co-created and co-designed process. And to answer your question, we really believe that design can really deliver on social value by ensuring that it is collaborative and it is impactful. And we do that through ensuring that it starts really early on in that design process. So it's really important to embed that social value considerations early on, really in the development of the foundation of how we approach design of public spaces. It's really important that we develop that through the co-creation of design briefs, right from the beginning before design even starts. So, for example, that could be the design brief of a project, but as we're talking here today, in wider planning and regeneration frameworks. Some good examples of that are, for example, we've worked on projects in Purley and Croydon, and it's about actually establishing that regeneration framework. How can you build social value into that space, understanding those aspirations from the local community, from local charity sectors, from local businesses? What are their priorities? What are their key issues? What are their aspirations? And how can we build that in to the strategy of design? So whether that is green networks, whether that is about opening up the public spaces for people to use it better. But also, as designers, it's not just about the physical, it's about enabling real needs, and that may include social connection. We're hearing aspects such as there's issues with, particularly in London, about belonging, identity, that sense of care that people really need to feel, but also that sense of safety, spaces for young people. So I would say, how does, for example, design deliver on social value? It's really about providing spaces for communities to really use these spaces. So it's like, how can you provide a framework for people to come together, to meet together and be more connected? How can they feel like their identity is embedded in the design of spaces? And we believe that's through co-design as well. So co-design meaning collaboratively designing with communities. So that's where architects and urban designers come together and work with the community to design the brief, but then design the spaces, and then also start to deliver what that looks like, who's operating those spaces. So this should also be involved in the design process. But what's really important about this is embedding the idea that it's representative. We have to really ensure that we're not just speaking to the louder voices. It needs to be representative of the people that use these public spaces and areas. We'll always use a benchmark, so ensuring that it is ethnically represented. Also looking at different ages, different abilities, and how just ensuring there's both stakeholder, business, community and resident perspectives that all really come together. And I think also as part of as architects and urban designers in spaces, we need to work together with local authorities and people that are already delivering social value to support them. It's not just about us coming into areas, it's about helping people to continue delivering on the social value that they're already doing. For example, some work we're doing in Barking and Dagenham has seen like local charity shops offer social value. So how can you offer spaces to continue those aspects, for those aspects to continue to flourish? I could probably go through other examples, but I'll probably stop there.
Well, we're probably going to have a lot more questions. Ms. Adebowale-Schwartz, what's your take on the design of public space and delivering that important social value for communities?
Well, it's called public space It's called public space for a reason, so it has to be a space that people can actually use. And I would agree, it depends for everyone. The places aren't just for the few, but for the many. And so placemaking is about how do you create collectively spaces and places which actually bring both joy, safety, jobs, and protecting the environment. I think the work that I've been doing for placemaking, it's been very much about what is inclusive in placemaking. If we're creating places that only a few people feel they can go to, then that's not well designed and it's not placemaking as far as I'm concerned, and as far as communities that I work with are concerned. I think in a way that placemaking can be something that could manage and support and create things that we've been talking about for centuries. And it's about health and well-being as well. I mean, I don't know who's actually gone out this morning and gone for a quick walk or had the opportunity to go for a walk that was safe, and how that feels when you can just go out to somewhere which is a safe space, a safe place. Some of what we need to do to make placemaking actually isn't that big a deal, and I don't understand really why we haven't done this better, all of us. And so Living Space Project is about supporting communities. It's listening. We don't co-design, we let them design and we bring in the resources if required and if wanted. And I do think as well one of the important things is that there is space for people to visit other spaces and places. There's a lot of young people that I work with or have worked with who actually feel they can't even go to a safe space where they live, let alone to another city. So that would be my very brief response to that, and I have more to say should you wish it later on.
Absolutely. Thank you. Mr. Burton, what's your take on this?
Well, I guess, I would start from, well, if you want to build social value into places and design, you have to have a common understanding of what you mean by social value, which I don't think we do. I would embrace within that understanding of social value an understanding of the importance of involvement in the process of change as well as the outcomes of that change. And I would believe you need to have something which sort of bakes it into the system. So this isn't kind of an optional thing, it's not a nice thing to do, it's something which is as necessary as meeting the building regulations or securing planning consent. And then I would ensure that it was at all stages, and I think this echoes much of what we've heard of the design process. So much regeneration discovers the significance and the interest in places after the event. It should start with a real understanding of what are the social networks, what is the existing social value, what are the existing resources in terms of community buildings, spaces, local organisations and groups at the very genesis of these ideas. You know, an audit of social value being the foundation from which everything else flows, including identifying where there are weaknesses in that and where the opportunities are for strengthening that, and then through the entire process of change, binding it into the processes of negotiation and co-design. There are ideas around which I could talk further about, such as community review groups, for example. We'll, I'm sure, touch on planning requirements, but social value statements are an exception, not the norm, in the way in which those planning rules and policies are decided. Master planning and briefs doesn't really build social value in, but could do if it was as fundamental as achieving environmental and economic outcomes. We have some legislation around procurement, but it's quite niche and quite narrow in terms of the Social Value Act, but the very act of the development process and the way in which the supply chains are identified and the process of development and change is procured. And then not forgetting about this after the event, that we need to really be able to look back and see what was achieved and whether we've achieved what we said we were going to achieve through an understanding, whether it be post-occupancy or whether it be enforcement or whether it be review. So we are guaranteeing that the promise with which we entered that initiative or that regeneration programme has actually been delivered, and if not, why not?
I wonder if I could just go back to what you were saying, Ms. Adeboale-Schwart, about, you said we don't co-design, we let them design. What does that mean? It's quite an astonishing thing to say, actually, because we're all about co-design at the moment. So I'm interested to hear what your take is on that.
I think my take is, and just to break it down, is that I'm getting older, but I've worked for too long to hear people thinking they have the all the capabilities and all the information that's required to create good places, placemaking. And what I have found, disturbingly, is that there's not enough support, and I don't mean necessarily telling communities what to do, but there's not enough resources to do any or most of what we're talking about. So communities should be at the head of what's happening out there. What does a good place look like? What does a good space look like, as I said? And I'm part of the London Sustainable Development Commission, and one of the things that we know is that the health and wellbeing piece is really, really important. It doesn't get enough time in general. Placemaking sometimes, as I said, can be seen as something that's quite soft. But if you talk to anyone that's working on health and wellbeing, as I've said, they will tell you quite quickly, actually, that makes people well is having their own space to talk about what's required when it comes to where you want to live, where they want to live, etc., and what they want life to be like. It needs to be co-designed. I meant that you can't design something on your own and then give it to someone as a gift. That's not a gift.
I understand that. We're quite familiar with the idea of co-design,
Yes.
but you actually said no co-design, let them design, and that was the challenge for me. That was an interesting.
Well, let them design is exactly what I mean by that. Yeah. Is that, you know, you can be next to an architect and they can help you out with some things, but don't take over. Don't think you know everything. Let them design. Let the people involved. That's the knowledge equity that we don't give any space for in most things. So that's what I would say. Okay. I mean by that.
Thank you very much for that clarification. Assembly Member Lord Bailey, you've got the next question.
I do. Just to pick up on the point you made there, Chair. I have been doing youth work and community work for over 35 years now, and a lot of this stuff sounds nice, but what it really amounts to is parachuting some lovely middle-class people into your area to spend the budget that you have died to raise. And it's very interesting, the no design versus co-design, because there's a tension there, because if it's done well, the co-design means you get in some expertise and help you didn't have. And if it's done badly, it means you're just doing as you're told. And I just wanted to ask a question, how is that avoided? How can you avoid taking over? Because if you come in as a professional, there is a point, you do know more, particularly when you're talking about planning. So how is that avoided? I'll leave that hanging. We'll come back to that theme. I'm going to go into something very specific now. In what ways is social value currently integrated into the planning process, and what are the challenges in doing so? And I'll come to Guy first with that question.
So it depends where you are in the country.
Okay.
There is an argument to say that social value is covered already by the National Planning Policy Framework, NPPF, but in the broadest sense, because it talks about sustainable development, doesn't specifically mention social value, but it does talk about sustainable development being social, economic and environmental impacts. And I think that's an important definition. So when we talk about social value, it means a triple bottom line approach to understanding how the built environment impacts society, community, the environment, and also the economy. Specifically, where is it integrated into the planning process at the moment? Well, we've been working with a number of planning authorities who are now putting it into their local plans very successfully. And I think there's two particular ways to get it into the planning process. One is through the local plan, which is plainly takes a bit of time. But just to quote a couple, Salford City have done it, Southampton City, and then close to home in London, Newham Council and also Tower Hamlets have integrated into their planning process. You can also get it in through validation lists, so you can require it to be part of the submission. So you might ask for a social value statement, for instance. And certainly when we're working with the developers, we work with them to try and get them to do a social value statement as a part of the process. So it is out there, it is sporadic at the moment, and I think what we need across London is a London plan that says every local council, every council should require a social value statement and should actually have a requirement for embedding social value into the planning process. And that's not only how it's submitted, but also how it's going to be considered. So you have to make sure that the Cabinet, the Planning Committee, know how to consider social value in their decision making as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Can I come to Stephanie and ask that particular question, because you are designing and making things and have that architectural skill. How do you find social value embedded in the planning system? Or do you? Let me put it that way.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, because I think it's very variable. As architects and urban designer, we're always bidding for projects. We always have to answer that question about social value. How are you going to deliver on it? And our concern a lot of the time is it doesn't give you enough space to do social value well. It doesn't give you enough information to know what are the existing structures that you need to build on. Who can you be supporting? It will be how much money are you going to give to for example, community centre, or how many apprenticeships are you going to offer? But as we've spoken about across the panel, could there be some skill building somewhere? Like we're working with, for example, in Brixton with the Brixton Soup Kitchen, and they're trying to find a space, and they do so much work. They, reach out to young people, to schools programs, they provide food, they provide belonging, and it's part of a legacy building and part of a framework from the Brixton riots, however many decades ago. But they just want to understand lease issues and to find a building that they can operate in that's sustainable. So for us to just sit with them for one day would provide such a great social value piece. I think for us, we see that it's embedded in local authorities well sometimes. So, for example, I mentioned in Barking and Dagenham, they have a community vision, and there's a series of projects that you can work towards developing. And that, to me, is a good way of building on social value. But at the moment, I think it is disparate. I don't think us as professionals necessarily know what social value is and how we can do it well. It's almost this form that you have to fill out that goes into the ether. I don't think communities necessarily understand the power that they have in social value of getting from procurement. So at the moment, I think there's a lot of work to do. I think there's a lot of work that architects and urban designers can do towards place-based areas, but really help to develop on social value in a place. So I can understand working in an area, the aspirations of a community, but I'd like to know that the other architect behind me can then get that information and build upon that. So how can we have a framework that's place-based, social value-based, the community know what you need to deliver, and we can be supporting it. So I think that's what we need to be doing, is supporting social value and supporting communities to flourish in their areas.
I'm going to come to you, Tony, around that question and see your experience, and ask the question: do you see social value embedded in the planning system? Is it there? If not, how not? If so, how?
So the short answer is no, I don't. It's one of those nice ideas which the planning system is sort of knocking about, and where there's an interest in it, then people pick it up and run with it, but there's absolutely no consistent application or understanding of the approach. And so it's sort of accidents of geography and accidents of personality rather than anything which you can sort of guarantee to be happening, which is why we do need to see it more explicitly recognised in national policy. The NPPF review is an obvious place. The London Plan also needs to be much more explicit about that. But there are opportunities at the local level, not just through local plans, but also through neighbourhood plans. One of the roles I convene the Forum for Neighbourhood Planners in London. And we're seeing innovation and ideas sort of generated through neighbourhood plans, which are sort of beyond local plans, and that kind of support is necessary. But it's just another thing, and local planning authorities are already stretched far too thinly. They don't have the resources and skills to do this, and without that, then it's all very well sort of asking for it, but you're not going to get it unless they've actually equipped to provide it. We also need to equip local communities to be able to engage but more widely around planning and whatever. I mean, I'm sort of bang on, we need a community practice, just like we've identified public practice as a way of skilling up local government across the country. Where's the community practice? Where's the support that enables that? But we also need to avoid this just becoming accommodated by development interests and others who will produce a whole lot of glossy social value statements and present a wonderful picture and a wonderful narrative about all the wonderful things they're doing in that area, which actually were going to happen anyway and really haven't moved the dial at all and aren't responding to local needs. So there needs to be a degree of rigour and challenge to the process if it's to be effective.
Thank you. Dr. Taylor, I'm going to come to you, because listening to the contributions of your two panel members, colleagues there, it seems like it might be hard to define social value within the planning system. Am I correct? Is that a correct start point?
Well, I think social value is like a slippery term, as value is, of course. So, yeah, you know, as was alluded to, we need to be clear what we're talking about. I mean, the key questions to ask are social value generated by whom and for whom, so who values what is produced. And to me, that gets to the heart of the issue, in that we're talking about relationships with people who are already in places. So, you know, I mean, it's wonderful this debate is happening, and I really welcome it. I do want to draw the committee's attention to the fact that Londoners have been mobilising around this issue for over 15 years. So I think concerns about social value or social benefit are absolutely part of the planning debate in London, but perhaps planning policy hasn't responded to them yet. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity to start to do that. But, you know, the issues that communities and small businesses, because I understand we have a particular focus on markets and industry and small businesses, you know, there is a particular problem in London of their functions and value, which are more than economic. They're not confined to the economic sphere. They are economic. People running successful businesses from markets, from small workshops, from industrial land on the high street. There is absolutely, you know, we are a small business economy. They fuel London's economy. They are economic, but they are more than economic. You know, and the term social value is very helpful there, as are terms like community benefit, which is one that, you know, I've used in my research with Professor Sara Gonzalez in Leeds on the community value of markets. You know, so I think, you know, I think we ought to remind ourselves what are the issues. And when we're talking about the economy in London, we have an issue in that the planning system is not valuing the existing more than economic functions of small businesses, in particular traders, and people operating from what would be seen as low-value workspaces. So social value is very helpful because it draws our attention to, you know, what is important to Londoners, to their quality of life, is not necessarily the value assigned to land and property through development. So I think, you know, questions of who and whom, for whom, by whom, take us into, this is not just, you know, something to be written into a policy. This is about ways of working. This is about how do we relate to existing functions in a high-cost, high-intensity city such as London. What commitments do we make to existing operators and users of those spaces? commitments that they will be included, that they will benefit from the improvements to come. At the moment, this is not part of the policy debate, but as I state, it has been part of the public debate in London for a good 15 years, and I think conversation is very overdue. I don't know if that's helpful.
I found it particularly helpful, this notion of who by whom is because I think this is going to be hard to pin down, because some things are very obvious. A home is always socially beneficial. A market is so, but how and who for and who gate, I think it's a very good question. And I also I don't like the term social value. I think it's amorphous and will have all kinds of nonsense attached to it. I think this community value situation is a little bit more accurate. Chair, back to you.
Assembly Member Baker, please. Oh, I beg your pardon. Well, I've got Assembly Member Baker first, and then I'll bring you in.
Thanks, Chair. I was going to follow up, and Dr. Taylor, you sort of very nicely segued into sort of what I was going to be asking, which is around sort of industrial space, economic space, and the fact that having a range of that small businesses that cater for that provide a variety of goods and services for different communities and provide a variety of jobs are absolutely essential. I think I would count those as having social value. One of the things that's happening is we are losing industrial floor space. I've got figures here that say it's 40% in London, 24% across London. Now, it feels to me that must contribute to the difficulties of making sure there is low-value workspace. Sounds like a horrible phrase, but I know what you mean. It's basically just cheaper spaces for people. How much of that is about basically just not having the space? What might be down to other factors? And what fundamentally might be able to be done about that? Stephanie Edwards, you were talking about some of the things that can be done around the edges, but it seems quite a fundamental problem that we don't have the space for a variety of good services. And that was a comment stroke question. Apologies. Well, the question was, and then I went on, was how much of that is down to the loss of industrial land and land for economic benefit, for economic use, versus other things that might be driving the loss of, I'll say it again with apologies, low-value workspace.
Thank you. The case of industrial land is probably like an extreme example of a much broader issue. You're right to draw attention to this language of low-value commercial land is not very attractive because, of course, people can operate very successful businesses within it. It's not that the value of their business is low, but how it's perceived in the planning system. So, I think protections on industrial land in the last few decades have not been tough enough, and benchmarks for release of industrial land have been exceeded every year since the first London plan. You'll have those figures, I'm sure. That has been driven to a great extent until recently by the shift from commercial to residential. Of course, we have a housing crisis. The pressure to develop residential is enormous, and well-located industrial and other commercial space that perhaps might be seen as underused by the planning system is sort of very attractive to developers and councils who often own these spaces. So even in the City of London, housing outbids employment uses, which I think is fascinating. So we have a problem here. Commercial space is squeezed, and it's squeezed by London's housing crisis and the pressure for residential. Now, my colleague, Professor Jessica Firm at UCL, has looked at the figures recently, and actually in the last few years it's shifted, and now the major factor driving commercial displacement in London is actually displacement by other commercial uses. So that is how big a problem we now have in terms of the squeeze on commercial workspace. I think you were alluding in your comment to, this question of does this matter? And I think does. It matters if we care about having local economies where people can walk or cycle to work, as Maria alluded to earlier. We want also people that have to work part-time or choose to work part-time. They have caring responsibilities. They need part-time jobs. So a lot of these industrial spaces or commercial spaces on high streets are located near to where people live. It's really important we protect those local economies. But also they underpin perhaps what we see as the higher value sectors of the economy. So they have a very important economic function, and we're concerned about the displacement of logistical functions, recycling, processing functions out of London, things like auto repair, lift repair, all of these things are being pushed out of London, and that is creating an economic problem for London. But yeah, as I think the case of industrial land is sort of the most visible tip of the iceberg, and actually, I really welcome the focus on commercial uses that the committee has brought with this inquiry. In terms of policy proposals, I mean, Just Space have organised, I think, around every, reiteration of the London Plan since its inception, saying we need stronger protections on low-cost workspace, on industrial land. We need stronger protections on markets. We also need to be expanding. We shouldn't just be protecting what we have. We need to be expanding. So, also, I think, small businesses perhaps are not organised or don't have the resources in the same way that other sectors of the economy are to sort of make their concerns and their voices heard to you. As I said, London is a majority small business economy. The FSB has like 3 part-time paid workers. They can't represent their interests in the same way that other sectors can. So I think there is a question about how planners relate to the economy here, what they see as economic value, and actually, it's important the session you're going to come that you're going to have some voices from communities and businesses that are very close to these issues, and it's important that the committee hears those directly. I'm very pleased you will. Yeah.
Thank you. Assembly Member Wilson, please.
Thank you, Chair. Now, I think all of us on the committee and the Assembly more widely, we kind of come at things from wide sort of range of political perspectives, but I think we would all agree with the general kind of situation that London is not building enough of pretty much everything, and in particular housing. We have a housing crisis, and we're desperate for development. Indeed, our previous meetings were discussing, looking at hurdles and barriers to development, some within the planning system itself, others very significant and very clear financial pressures. So whilst it's, I think, proving to be quite hard to pin down a kind of confirmed and agreed definition of social value, but with this kind of growing acceptance of a need to try and fit something that relates to it into new development, but bearing in mind the existing constraints, who should be paying for this?
Who wants to come back on that?
Who should be paying for?
Making this viable within a development kind of context where we're already facing a lot of financial challenges. How do we find the resource and the funding to make this happen as part of that?
So, I mean, I think social value shouldn't cost you any more. I mean, that's the starting point. And I think we've kind of gone down a slightly different route than I thought we'd go down, because we're sort of talking about the what you're building as opposed to how you're building it, or how you are managing the development. And I think it's important just to bring us back to those two. And so when you start talking about the what, it's sort of, what is it? Are you building housing? Is that right for the place? Are you building industrial units? Is that right? That's a kind of larger planning, spatial sort of conversation. When you're talking about the how, when I'll come to the cost in a moment, you're talking about how you're going to build it. So how are you engaging with the community? How are you going to get the contractor to deliver social value through the contracting process? How are you going to engage with the occupier to ensure they're delivering social value through their occupation? And if we stick with the how, it shouldn't cost more. And so my view, strong view, is that the cost of delivering social value needs to be borne by whoever is doing the development, because they want permission to develop. They need to be thinking about that wider contribution that they're going to make as part of their sort of planning submission, if you like, or part of the built environment. And that needs to be integrated in the planning process. And then, importantly, that needs to then be somehow contractualised. So the other really important thing that we need to be sort of clear about is that, and I think, Lord Bailey, you mentioned it, some frustration at sort of the wishy-washy term of social value. I mean, I think it is possible to define it, by the way. But the important thing is that we've got to be able to deliver it, which means you need to be able to measure it. And if you can measure it, then you can monitor it, then you can prove that you've delivered. And one of the biggest challenges I think we have within the planning process is trust. So a Grosvenor survey that some of you might know that came out in 2019, the public were asked, what percentage of you do you trust the developer to look after your interests? The answer was just 2%. I found that shocking. Even more shocking, the same question was asked of that group. What percentage of you believe that the local authority will look after your interests? Only 7% said yes. So we have a trust deficit, and I think social value is the way that we can build on that trust deficit by engaging the community early on, by having a measurement framework. We work with the TOM system as the way, and then getting developers and then getting occupiers as well to commit to delivering social value, and then holding them to account and ensuring that is transparent throughout that process.
Anybody else want to come in? No, you.
Just in response, and I agree with everything you've said. I think there is a big issue about unused spaces, and actually we're losing a lot of heritage that way as well. I think there's so many places in London where you see these wonderful buildings that have just been left, and you just wonder, well, who's not getting the benefit out of that? And yet at the same time, when I'm talking to local communities, they are not been given any keys to the doors. They're meant to somehow bring the cash in. Well, actually, I think quite a lot of local authorities should see this as something which actually creates a much healthier area. It brings in resources, and it brings in new work and new jobs. I don't know if I should say this, but I live in Lewisham, and I walk around with other people, and sometimes we see these buildings and they've just been left. And sometimes what happens, and it's not just where I am, is that it's seen as something that communities should just get on with and do without any resources whatsoever. I read recently, and I'm trying to remember where, but there was a big thing about the lack of, there's lots of railway spaces, and they're not being used at all. So, you know, if those spaces could be used or given or provided or co-owned by local communities, that's going to be more spaces that are required. I think I'd probably stop there, but it just seems to me that there's so many things that we keep saying over and over again every 5 years, saying the similar thing, the same old thing. And what we're looking really at is, for me, social value is also about social justice. Social justice is allowing yourself to have everything you should, and that's a home. It's actually the rights to be who you are. It's access to spaces. It's access to anything, and it seems to me social value is a kind of soft touch to that, but it's very hard touch in the sense that's what it's really saying. And if we're not saying that, then we should do better at communicating and listening as to what that is.
Thank you. If there's no other Assembly member, Lord Bailey.
A question, maybe to Guy. We went on a visit to the Olympic Park, and they have done quite a fairly good way of capturing social value, in my opinion. I want to see if it could be embedded in the planning system. So they have a ULA building, it's a university, London College of Fashion, and in their lease, they have made them provide amenity to the locals. And they've gone right down to the granular level. You've got to make it welcoming. They must be able to come in here and not spend money as well as spend money, all of those things. And I'm literally asking the very simple question, is it possible to capture that sort of activity within the planning system? Because they have done it, because they're a mayoral development company and have us behind them. But is it possible to capture that legally in the planning system?
Legally? Well, in theory, yes. Certainly through the planning process, you can capture social value in construction. So you can through the planning, you can ask your developer and the contractor to commit to a level of social value. And that might be jobs created, it might be apprenticeships, might be visiting schools, whatever it is. You then have to think about the occupied, the in-use phase. And there's two ways you can capture social value on that. One is the actual use of it, like, for instance, as you just mentioned. The other is how that development is managed. You've got two parts to it. There is precedent. Green plans, travel plans are required quite often as part of Section 106 submissions. And you have to submit it at the point of occupation. You have to update it in 3 years' time. And in Hammersmith and Fulham, you have to update it after 5 years. And there's a commitment that there will be a travel plan. Now, on that basis, we've been working with the British, the Better Buildings Partnership to develop a social lease. So that is a lease that could be asked for as part of Section 106 to require the developer to include social value as part of their commitment ongoing. Islington are taking this really a long way. So, like Newham, they have social spaces that are peppercorn rent, and the developer has to lease them or has to allow them to be occupied by minority-owned businesses, for instance, and many other businesses. So there is lots of precedents in London, but it's not brought together under the London Plan at the moment. But if you bring these things together, I think you can generate a plan and guidance for all the local authorities that are out there that will allow you to deliver a lot more social value. And I think that's key to it. And just to give you, I'm going to throw a number at you. And I know you might not want the numbers, but we've been working with a company called Redevco in a place called James Street, and that's just off Oxford Street. And they've unlocked, through a period of 10 years, they've identified on a developer's development of £50 million, social value worth £50 million over 10 years. That, in theory, could be locked in as part of the Section 106.
We love the figures on this committee, so you keep throwing them. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Just to remind members, we're over halfway through and we haven't got through half the questions, just as a small incentive for you to. Assembly Member Small Edwards is to ask the next question.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, panel. It's something that quite a few of you have alluded to so far in your answers, but my question is around measuring social value and how we should be measuring it. Tanric, as you're nodding, so maybe I'll come to you first as a result.
Yeah, thank you so much, and great to come back to that. Thank you, because it's core. I think for me, this is about the issue we have is that existing social value is not measured. So it's very hard for new development to ensure it doesn't damage existing social value if it doesn't know what the existing social value is, and with all the provisos about what I said about that concept in terms of we need to know who is delivering social value and who is benefiting from that social value. But, you know, the planning system needs, well, I would suggest, or to require local authorities to understand existing social value, in my concern in particular in relation to local economies, and ask developers to ensure, A, they're not damaging that, and B, they are enhancing that. And as a bare minimum, that needs to involve including existing occupiers in new developments, such that they can continue to benefit from the improvements that come, because if they're already displaced, they're not going to benefit from any new social value delivered, and we would be taking a very narrow view if we saw that as a success, I would say. So a measurement of social value, for me, it's about understanding the existing value and benefit, and I think we don't need to be obsessive about the term. I think we know what we're talking about here, more than economic. We know it's not just, you know, the land value that matters. We know it's not just the property value that matters. We know it's not just the developers' profits that matter. We know value is much bigger than that. And we know that we need to talk to the people who live in the area that will actually use it to find out its importance. So with the research I mentioned on markets, the Markets for People project, what was novel about that research was that it asked existing users, existing customers of a market, well, 3 exemplary retail markets in the UK, including Queen's Market in Newham, and it asked 500 customers in a representative survey what they currently valued about the market. So it asked them quantitative questions about qualitative matters, economic, social, and cultural. And it produced the most powerful statistics. People feel less lonely when they're at the market. They feel like they belong. You know, rates of satisfaction in the 95s plus. This is an overwhelmingly successful and specialised market whose value is unfortunately still poorly, insufficiently understood in the planning system. So we can say, it's okay, we're going to retain the market, but because we're not really committing to its existing functions and its existing traders and users, you know, to come back to the point about trust, unfortunately, traders and customers are fearful about redevelopments and improvement schemes because they think you're going to change the nature of the market. The traders will be displaced. I won't be able to access my affordable goods and see the communities that I value when I come here. So for me, it's about you know, incorporating within the planning system a requirement to understand existing uses and functions and values to people who live and work in an area, and requiring developers to ensure they don't damage that and that they improve it, which means committing to include people and committing to working with them. Yeah.
Can I jump in, please? So we've been working with the Local Government Association since 2017 to measure social value, and they've adopted, or many of their members have adopted the TOM system as the way of measuring social value. That stands for Themes, Outcomes and Measures. And it allows you to identify a series of outcomes and then measures, and allows you to put a value to it. Now, the TOM system started out in procurement because the Social Value Act is a procurement act, it's not a planning act, it's for procurement. But the reason that places like Salford, Waltham Forest, Newham, all these places have adopted or started to embed social value into planning is because they've seen the incredible success coming out of procurement. I mean, procurement is delivering unbelievable social value now throughout the country. So as an average, we monitor, we do about, at any one point we might have about 1,000 different procurements that we're involved in. And on average, we see an additional 20% of social value coming out of the contract. So for every pound spent, there's additional 20 pence in value being delivered for communities in terms of jobs for disadvantaged people, like ex-offenders, or that could be tons of carbon saved. This could be investment in the community. And so I think what's very important in the discussion is that we sort of bring it down to things that are measurable. I'm an engineer, and I make no apologies for the fact that I love measurement, and I like facts, and I like to be able to stand in front of a community and say, look, with the developer, this is what we promised, and a year later, having built it, this is what we've delivered. And in X years' time, we will deliver this. So I think that as we go through this process, it's really important we consider how we are going to how we're going to measure and be transparent and be accountable for this. The reason why trust is such a deficit is the accountability has failed. Local authorities let down communities, developers have let down communities, and we've got to shift that. And I think you need a system that allows you to hold your own selves to account for that.
Thank you. Yes, Stephanie.
I'd just like to jump in as well, just to talk about measurement in the sense of actually working with communities, supporting communities, ensuring that procurement lends to, as you said, building and enhancing on the great social value that's already in our places. And this is probably less of a clear answer, but I think we also need to go beyond the tangibles, because I think a lot of social value is built within actually the feeling, actually within that sense of belonging, that lack of loneliness, that sense of connection, a lot of very bespoke criteria that we need to be measuring our social value against. If we know this is a really key community that has particular social assets, we need to be able to keep that, but we need to know that we need to ensure that if we re-provide it in another area, that we may be losing some aspects to that. So how can we start to really embed that kind of qualitative measurement process in there too? An example is a framework in Dagenham Heathway, and it's very much focused on they have very specific wants, and it was about ensuring that you fix very clear things such as safety, cleanliness, maintenance ahead of co-design art projects and murals. Weirdly, it seems really a simple thing, but as soon as you start painting a wall without cleaning the streets, you've completely damaged trust, you've damaged that sense of belonging and that sense of care. Like, these things are slightly intangible. You can still say that you have improved this amount of square metres of public space. It's just in the wrong order, and it's not aspiring to that priority. And so I'd really encourage us to be looking at, I think, also to that question of who pays for this. Social value gives us that opportunity to embed planning teams, equalities teams, public health teams, so many different essentially departments that can come together and spend their budgets to develop upon value that is needed. So I would say we need a framework for social value that's really clear. We need to develop really bespoke criteria that we can measure against, and not, if we can't measure it, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So I know it's slightly beyond the realms of like measurements, but I think we need to go beyond the tick box, because that's where the real social value is really strong and key.
Yeah, thank you very much for your answers. I'd love to follow up, but I think we're a bit short of time, so I'll hand back to the chair. Thank you.
Yes, you can see the anxiety on my face, can't you? Assembly Member Garbett, please.
Thank you. I'm really enjoying this discussion so far. Thank you all for your contributions. I previously worked in the NHS doing social value and procurement, so I very much know the impact of social value and procurement. Just to build on the same theme, I've really enjoyed the kind of discussion around the kind of add-on social value that you can bring in for regeneration and planning, and the existence of social value within a community. So my question, to start with Stephanie, is to what extent is existing social value of place considered in regeneration, but also what are the impacts if we don't consider social value in? I know you've alluded to this, but I just want to be really clear about what the, some negative impacts might be if we don't do this. Thank you.
I think as some of the discussion has discovered, is it's very different. So you can start to work in an area where people are very clear about what the social value is. There's some great regeneration teams who have great engagement officers who understand the relationships. They give you a full stakeholder list. They like, you need this, you need to talk to this person before you start to, build your stakeholder mapping, for example, which is really important to start to then engage. So some are done really well, and I think where it's done well, it helps us to ensure that we're working with the right people, because the social value is also part of the process of involving people to actually start to create and develop upon social value together with them. It's a co-design and collaborative process, I would see it as. So I think it's done really well in particular areas. We're working with Hounslow local authority at the moment, who we're developing a public realm design guidance with them, and they're very clear that we need to try and understand and work with the community to understand how does your public space feed into creating socially cohesive spaces that are, have appropriate identity, that serve you in terms of your recreation, but also your culture and all of the different facets that you have. And they have involved 13 of their different departments, such as the Equalities Network and their planning and regeneration teams. That's working really well. I think the problem is when you just go into a development and you feel as if, as an outsider, that you are delivering the only social value is a problem, because we can then measure to say, for example, we have enhance the social value by 50% without knowing what that social value is. Social value can be hidden. I agree the term, it's really hard to explain. I think actually it's not very inclusive as a name, and it almost needs a bit of a branding exercise, but I think the worry is you lose the social value through no bad intentions. So I'd say that having that benchmark, having actually a panel like a social value community representative panel of stakeholders and community members and residents, I think would be important, and to ensure it's iterative. If you understand social value 4 years ago is probably very different to now, so how can we keep evolving in the process and recording that?
Great, thank you. I don't know if others wanted to come in, maybe... Oh yeah, great, thanks.
I mean, I would echo all that. I mean, I think no local plan has ever failed for not understanding the social value in the location. There's the evidence base, the standard evidence base that's produced for what's one of the more coherent forward plans for an area. You know, the local plan doesn't have an understanding of social value. So again, we know how to do it, but we're not doing it consistently. So it's not a lack of knowledge or methodology or insight or approach, and there are great examples, but they're exceptions and not rules. And until we make this a normal thing as opposed to an exceptional thing, then we're not really going to move things forward.
Thanks, that's really helpful. I know we're short on time, but did anyone else want to come in on that?
Can I just add something to that? I think one of the things that we're talking about, or we're missing at the moment, is also talking about the other ways in which there is placemaking or inclusion, but also improving people's well-being and resources, economic resources. I think one of the things that's happening in London at the moment, I'm not sure for how long, but hopefully for a long time, is also supporting not just projects, but different types of clusters. So we talked about clean tech. We've talked about, well, we haven't so much, but women in clean tech. There's very little resources for that in London. And also about how we leverage green finance. Now, that sounds like a bit sort of something you're wearing your T-shirt to show off, but actually, green finance is really important to make any space or community. Actually, it's really important to have that as part of an area. Should be able to provide or develop or provide resources for people who do want to get in those different sections. We're not really talking about those that much. And I know a lot of women don't get into clean tech, and so one of the things that the LSDC's been doing is how can we help resource that or get other people to help resource it. So I think there's a bigger conversation, especially when it comes to women or someone who identifies as a woman, that actually we're not quite doing as well as we could around some of this and asking some of the wider questions.
Assembly Member Hirani, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to start my question with Maria, because you've already, to some extent, spoken a bit about the work at the LSDC and in your previous answer as well. But in terms of the LSDC and the Mayor's work on social value, how do you feel it's encouraged planners and developers to embed social value into the policies that they have?
I think it's just been basically by listening to organisations, to individuals, to the people living in London, but also just finding out what's required, not just what's required, but also we sometimes go into a conversation thinking that we're asking for help, but actually it's the other way around. Local communities are providing a lot of information, a lot of resources, a lot of intelligence, and that's a big part for us, and which is why we kind of gone slightly to the clean tech piece, etc. It's what else can we support that's already happening. You might need to ask me that question again so I can finish it.
Yeah. No, just a question on to what extent the LSDC and the Mayor's work on social value has encouraged planners and developers to embed social value into their policies.
I think massively, actually. I think sometimes developers need to hear something from another organisation, where we are an organisation that are trying to do things right, to listen, and to create things that are required and what people want from the LSDC. That's our role. That's part of our role. And so it's listening rather than thinking you know the answers. I think that's the thing that we do best. And we also are quite willing and happy to work with other organisations or individuals to help things happen if that's what's required by local communities, etc.
Okay. Guy, you want to come in on this?
Yeah, no, so I just sort of the broadest, I mean, it's a great report, by the way. There's some really good recommendations in it, not least specifically the London plan needs to require every developer to make a social value statement in some form. That is so important. And I say it's important because we were advising Islington on their local plan. The inspector came in and refused them to allow them to ask for a social value statement, so they had to take it out. I mean, that is just, I just couldn't get over it. It really upset me. And they'd spent a lot of time trying to work out and justifying it, but somehow the inspector said it's not relevant to communities. You can't ask for a social value statement. And it's just like, if they had had the air cover of you guys, of the London plan, that would not have happened. So it's so important you kind of act on this as quick as possible, get social value into the London plan, and make it obvious to every single local authority in London that they have permission to embed social value into the planning process. And then, to a certain extent, you know, we need to allow developers to interpret it how they want to interpret it, although there needs to be some form of framework. And I totally understand Stephanie's point about tick box. What I will say in justification of tick box is that you have to allow for a lot of developers who just need to get on and do stuff. They don't have the money or time to start doing lots of exploration with all the communities that they might need to. So having a tick box is actually quite useful. Guidance. This is what they can do, and this is what they need to get on and do. And some developers will have additional resources, and they can do more. And it's always finding that balance. It's like the discussion around viability. You've got to find the balance as you're understanding the planning process. There's no good piling layer upon layer upon layer of expectation on the developer, like social housing, because they'll just say, sorry, we can't do that anymore. You've exceeded our viability. So it's a matter of finding that fine balance between providing a tick box, a simple way that people can just get on with it, but still allowing that innovation and creativity that we so need. And I think the key, one last point on this, is that it's really important that within the, however you go about including in the plan, is your starting point is understanding needs of the community. So yes, a social value statement, but the golden thread that Maria mentions in her document, you've got to make sure there's a golden thread that runs through the needs of the community, to the design, through construction, to use. That golden thread of social value, and that needs to link ultimately to what the local authority is trying to do around their plan.
Just because I know there's a couple that want to come in, just to maybe throw a bit of contradiction, because sometimes there may be competing values on that. So what might be broader, better for the borough, if you like, if they've got a large, let's say, temporary accommodation waiting list, versus what a community in a particular area want in that moment in time. There is that conflict sometimes that can emerge. And how would you anticipate that being dealt with in that scenario?
I think it's just having a solid conversation, really, and been very open. I mean, the funders that I've worked around actually quite often are a bit dizzy about it all. And they know they want to do something good, but they're not quite sure what that looks like. Well, that's why we're kind of there to help with that. So I'm thinking of one that's already been mentioned, Unibale.
Yeah. Westfield Unibale.
Yeah, and they're also in the heart of this area too. And I think it's listening to them, but just recognising actually they want to know what the right thing to do is. And I think sometimes we come in, or people or other organisations come in, they're so frightened they're going to lose their money, they don't actually say what they want. And I think some of the bigger organisations that fund are really looking to just tell us what you want with this. We're quite happy to do it, actually. And they're the ones I've found that are also connected to other cities and other areas because they've done it before. So I think don't be scared of the ask, basically.
Tony, you want to come in?
Yeah, I was going back to your original question, but I should say I was part of the team that produced the work that LSDC has published, and I mean, I suppose maybe I would say this, wouldn't I? But there's a lot of recommendations in there which haven't been picked up yet and which haven't been followed through. So you've got, frankly, as a committee, you've got a checklist there which you might want to consider of what needs to happen. And who knows whether the London plan will embrace this. Two I would sort of maybe draw particular attention to, and which are particularly challenging. One around building the capabilities of both communities and local authorities to actually understand and use this process. That requires a different level of support or a different role. Whether or not that's for the mayor or GLA, it's fit for you to judge. But that it won't work without it. And the other is if good growth continues to be a North Star, then it needs to be good growth in which social value, speaks loud and speaks truth. And that is really unclear at the moment. And without it, again, what lies behind what we've been talking about really doesn't imbue itself across the wider mission that the mayor has set out.
Stephanie.
Just a quick one on just Guy, as you mentioned about the tick box. I think actually it's important, I agree, that you just need guidance. Like if you have a framework that you can say, this is the framework, this is the existing social value, and this is what you need to deliver on, and we're guiding people towards that. So I just wanted to come back to say I agree with that. And then also just in response to this idea of what communities think, I think a lot of the time when communities think, it's because we don't always talk to a representative group of people. Actually, it's usually a strong voice that have a very strong opinion, and sometimes about having those conversations, because sometimes a lot of the time it's just one way, and social value really needs to be quite circular.
Thank you. Dr. Taylor?
Thank you. I just wanted to comment on a few aspects of the Mayor's kind of social value agenda. I think that's what your question was asking about. To pick up firstly on the Good Growth Fund, so in terms of markets, which I understand is the focus of this inquiry, there have been quite a few market regeneration projects funded by or received money from the Good Growth Fund, which is a good thing. But the social value toolkit, which again has been developed, which is quite innovative, but it does focus on the kind of specific projects and initiatives, not necessarily on understanding existing social values. So that's actually a good example of the sort of issue I was speaking to, that you would want in future that to develop to have like a baseline of existing social value, and then for any interventions, a bit like my colleague was talking about what they need at Queen's Market, one of the recipients, the basics, security, cleaning, lighting, toilets, and until those are addressed, you don't have the trust really to do anything else. And so working from the existing baseline and setting priorities from that. I do want to draw the committee's attention to some proposals for inclusive market redevelopment that we developed with the Markets for People project, like learning from lots of case studies around the country. And I would think any future good growth scheme that funds projects in markets ought to think about adopting the principles of inclusive market redevelopment there to make sure existing traders and communities benefit. And with the London Plan, it's wonderful to hear about this movement to embed social value. I think that's excellent. I mean, including that broad understanding of the social benefits of local economies in the evidence base underpinning the local plan is essential, and it is missing. And Just Space has had conversations with the GLA economics team over the years to try to open that up, and that would be worth revisiting. But as I said, I think it's as much about representation and involvement and making sure that the planning team are hearing the voices from the local economies. I do want to comment lastly, there's one issue about the London Markets Board and just looking about the representation, like communities, customers are not actually represented on the London Markets Board, and I think that's a bit of a gap. It has been innovative in many ways, but it hasn't quite addressed concerns that communities have about gentrification of markets. And then lastly, I know Places for London is kind of on your agenda in terms of thinking about the Mayor's portfolio and different routes in which the Mayor can embed social value. I've been until recently on the board of the Ward's Corner Community Benefit Society, which is trying to bring forward the community plan for Seven Sisters Market in the Latin Village, which has a mayoral commitment to a bidding process linked to traders, which is now underway. And the Community Benefit Society is now working in partnership with Transport for London, or Places for London, rather, on a long lease, which is wonderful. So again, in many ways, it has been innovative, but it has been marred by the absence of like an overarching social value policy. And also, likewise, a kind of culture of working with traders and community groups. So there's 2 points there, the policy point, but also the culture and the ways of working. And we have done some work with Markets for People on sort of supporting trader and community-run markets. And so it's not just the policy, it's also about the culture and the ways of working in partnership that I wanted to just draw your attention to.
No, thank you. And I'd highly echo, I think, your point about making sure you're working with people. I can think of an instance in my constituency where local authority had been talking to the market operator rather than the traders themselves, and you can just see there's a real difference in opinion and the multiple views that you get as a result of not engaging with people who are affected on the ground. So I echo that. So, but how do you feel, just to follow on that, how do you feel that policies or incentives can be structured to prioritise retention? You mentioned the point about the baseline, but how can that be realised in policy?
That's such a key issue. So it's often about making commitments to include existing traders, of course. If that commitment is made up front, actually people will have all sorts of conversations because they know they'll be included. It's about rent levels, commitment to retaining affordable rent levels into the future. It's about minimising disruption for existing traders, like markets in particular are complex ecosystems, and you need to minimise moves if you don't want to lose your existing market. We've got things in here also about looking at where your income stream is coming from, and so that you're not creating a problem by requiring a rate of return that requires you to push rents up. So sort of all sorts of things about how the scheme is structured that you want to get right at the beginning so you don't end up with a problem later down the line. But we've also proposed things like actually monitoring the inclusivity of redevelopment schemes. So how many traders are retained, from what trader groups, serving what customer groups, is the customer base shifting to a higher income base over time? Are certain ethnic groups shrinking or being retained?
Yeah.
It's those kind of things. But I have it in the report, which I'd be glad to leave you with.
I think the committee would probably can I just come up with one final quick question, because just thinking about sort of what the opposite of social value would be. So if, let's say, as part of development, there's a commercial space that ends up being, I don't know, a betting shop where there's a proliferation of betting shops already, how can we prevent that sort of happening in terms of planning process, but also just taking into account sort of the harms that could potentially develop as a result of, again, we are sort of moving into what could potentially go into buildings if there's no clear definition of what might come into a commercial space. How can we sort of prevent that as well? Tony?
Quick advice, please.
Yeah, I mean, by understanding what's there at the moment, by building that into a policy understanding of what cumulative change could be harmful, and by building on the precedent that's already set. So things like fast food next to schools, for example, is an area which has already been established as a mechanism which can be managed and controlled through the planning system. So building on those kinds of precedents to address precisely the kinds of issues that you're describing, which would rule out negative change, which has a negative social impact, and would rule in positive social impact. So it's really good evidence, a good understanding of the local area, which is properly informed, and using the levers that are available. Obviously, we can have a debate about whether you could strengthen those planning levers and make them more effective than they are at the moment.
Okay. I'll stop there because I know that time is...
I know I've got two Assembly members who want to ask questions. Remember, we can write and get the responses if these questions open up a new area, I'm going to rule them out. But Assembly Member Garbett will try with you very quickly.
Oh, okay.
Quick
So I
responses,
quickly want to touch on ownership, because often where a space is defined as social value, the people that create the space or exist in the space often don't have ownership over the space. For example, markets where a council might own the space, but it's the traders that make it a market. I just wondered if you think that the asset of community value designation in the London Plan is strong enough, or if it could be strengthened in this.
Can we have one reply to
one reply?
Possible, unless there's Mr. Burton.
Well, yes, it could be
Dr.
strengthened.
Taylor.
You know, a commitment. If there is a designated asset of community value, that means a group cares enough to have done the work to get it designated, and you know. It's not just about recognising the designation, but actually a commitment to work with that group to restore and bring that building back into use or ensure it can remain for community benefit in the longer term.
But just briefly, it doesn't give you any ownership. So it's not, and it's not a planning measure. It's separate from the planning system, so it needs to be developed. There are signs that may be happening, but then we'll need the community ownership fund to be given the support that's necessary for the transformation that's needed.
And finally, Assembly Member Wilson, if this please be quick.
Thank you. In the interest of timing, I'll make it a plea rather than a question, so don't feel compelled to answer. But I think, Guy, you mentioned probably what's one of the most important words in any discussion about planning, is balance. So I think the discussion we've had about trying to understand the baseline is crucial and understand what's there already and the value that's generated there already. But what I would say is also often, particularly with new development, the principal beneficiaries of that new development, the owners of the new houses, the people who work in new jobs, they're not in place yet. So how do we, can we try and make sure that those voices aren't lost in the wider discussion as well?
And there's nodding heads, which we can take as a reply. Thank you very much. We've now reached the end of our session, and I'd like to thank our guests for attending this meeting and for all your contributions today. It's been very interesting, especially on what is social value. We will now take a short adjournment while we change panels. Thank you for probably 10 minutes? 10 minutes. Welcome back to the Planning and Regeneration Committee. We're now going to continue our discussion on the concept of social value in planning and regeneration. I would now like to welcome our second panel of guests. We are joined by Chrissy Nicholson, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the London Trades Guild, Sarah Goldsweig. If I got a name earlier wrong in the previous, is that close enough? Yes, it's right. Research and Project Officer at the Latin Elephant. Stephen Biggs, Corporate Director, Commonwealth Building for the Community Wealth Building for London Borough of Hillingdon. Nicholas Kasich, Markets Manager for the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, and Bryce Tudball, Head of Spatial Planning and Placemaking and Housing at the London Borough of Haringey. Now, if I've got your names wrong at any point, please do correct me. It's my thing. So the first question that I'd like to address, let's start off with Mr. Kasich. What does social value mean to you and the organisations you represent?
I suppose first that depends on which organisations I represent. So in terms of the London boroughs, of course we have those definitions which are council definitions, but then we will also have other market operators which can be community interest markets, it can be private operators, where cash is king, and we have alternative providers as well. So across the board, the term social value is a wide, shall we say, it has a very wide definition, but it mostly revolves and should really be replaced by the words community value and what it brings to the community. Because if I said to a market trader on Portobello Road, what does social value mean to you? They go, what are you on about, Nick? The terminology is not common. It's not common English to those people on the street. So therefore, the social value of everything does revolve around what happens for the community in the place. So that's keeping it a short and contained answer.
Those are the kind of answers we really like here. Ms. Nicholson, what does it mean to you and your organisations? Because you've got quite a few under the London Trades Guild.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's nice to see you. So I would say that social value is so many things, and if you want short, pithy answers, then I'm afraid you've come to the wrong person. And I think we have to be really alive and sensitive to the fact that if we're too prescriptive in defining it, we're going to, cause damage unintentionally. So I think it's really important that we keep our minds and our imaginations wide open when we're thinking about social value. But to try and whittle it down, I suppose under social value, we have cultural, environmental, and economic value. And all of those three categories, if you like, also are very, very broad and will mean different things to different people. For our organisation, which is a membership organisation of socially trading organisations, of small businesses and social enterprises, I guess social value to them is service to the community. So it's providing essential activities that are foundational to the community. So it's what local residents in boroughs actually need. So it's not coming from diktats from the top, from the DLA, or from landlords about what they want and what they can extract in terms of profit and market value, but it's actually coming from the ground in terms of what local people say they need and they want in their local communities. So that, for me, would be social value.
Thank you. And Ms. Goldsweig, what about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to echo a lot of what Chrissy just said, but so just for a little bit of background, my work at Lad and Elephant is facilitation of a coalition of 9 different campaign groups across London, from a variety of markets and retail spaces. Some are owned by council, some are owned by private landlords. And each of these campaigns and organizations is fighting against what they see as retail gentrification of their area. Many of these are in opportunity areas, so they're kind of at the center of a lot of the development that's coming, both I think from kind of the pan-London level and from the local authority. And these campaigns see these sites not just as kind of spaces of economic activity, but also as some of kind of community's most important social and cultural spaces. And I think particularly in the cases of the campaigns that I'm representing, they see it as, they see these spaces as important to low-income, racialized, and otherwise marginalized communities. And I think, you know, one of our coalition members has said about social value that if you lose it, you can't put it past in after development. There's something ephemeral about it. I think what you said about it being what the community's needs are and coming from the ground up is really important, that being prescriptive about it runs the risk of causing significant harm. So I do think that, at least in terms of what the communities that we're speaking to think of social value, that it is quite aligned. I also think that, importantly, social value to a lot of communities is not something that's that should be quantified or is quantifiable. I think that there's a very large disconnect between how policymakers and even academics are talking about social value and how it's being used maybe more colloquially by people on the ground. And, you know, a lack of kind of, I think, a definition that's agreed to by those on the ground and by those in positions of power is going to lead to a lot of miscommunication and a lot of kind of perpetuated harm.
So as we heard earlier, would the term community value be better than social value?
I mean, I guess the question is who's still determining what that value is. So decisions about value are political, and I think we feel very strongly that planning is political, even if it's it maybe occasionally purports to not be so. If the value is community determined value, then maybe that's more important than community value, because if the kind of calculation of that value is still being done from the top, it's still being done by policymakers, by developers, and not from the people who are actually using these spaces, it doesn't matter what you call it, the harm is still being perpetuated.
Yeah.
So perhaps communities value rather than community value.
So the possessive, yeah. That's probably more accurate.
Great, thank you. Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
If someone takes your point and agrees, I did 35 years of youth mainly, but community work as well. There was always a hierarchy in a community, either the people who shout the loudest, the people who are closest to the power. How do you get around that if it isn't defined by someone somewhere? A wider question would be, how do we fund it, support it, if you say it can't or shouldn't be measured? Politics has a responsibility to measure what it is funding, because no government on the planet has any money. The money belongs to somebody else, and they're the stewards of that. So there's a tension in what you're describing, and how do you get around those tensions?
I don't know. I mean, maybe this is a little bit more philosophical. I don't know if you get around the tension. I think that that's something that, you know, whether you're working in politics or you're working with community groups on the ground, you're constantly navigating. I think that the question is not whether some aspects of it can be measured, right? Whether health outcomes can't be measured when you're looking at what these spaces provide to people in terms of opportunities for solidarity, for care, for mental health, whether you're looking at the environmental impact of these spaces. That stuff can be measured, but I do think that that's insufficient. And looking to that as being kind of the, not just the bare minimum, but like what the expected maybe process is. We'll leave a lot of things out and we'll leave a lot of people out.
I do see that some qualitative things are hard to measure. That's always been the trouble for governments. I just want to bring in Mr. Gunzun, because you seem to nod, and I am very interested in the philosophical, because that's the basis, because you'd be asking people to use their political position to impose a set of rules where somebody's going to lose. I had talk with my colleagues earlier on. They were like, well, we need to understand that as politicians somebody will lose. But I'm really interested in attention within a community and why, who gets to be prominent, who gets to choose, who gets to win.
Is it okay if I have a go at answering that? So I think it's really important as policymakers that when you're talking to local community groups that you're really, really thoughtful about the methodologies that they deploy. And I think you're right. I think that some community groups lack resources and lack capacity. And, that's for a whole raft of reasons, economic ones, predominantly political ones. Those from disadvantaged backgrounds may struggle, but where they are using a community organising methodology, they are more powerful and they are louder, and that is a dispersed power that is democratic. So if we're thinking about what community groups you want to talk to, I guess it's those community groups that are most representative and who are alive and sensitive to who has the loudest voices and why they have the loudest voices. There's a whole raft of books on community organising that you can look at. There's one called Community Organising for the Gilded Age that talks about organic leaders, so leaders that aren't necessarily in positions, recognisable positions of power. So I would suggest that Len Maloney, who is one of our members, who is in an arch in Haggerston, which is currently under threat by the landlord Places for London, is an organic leader. He's not necessarily immediately identifiable as somebody who should sit at a policy making decision table, but he is somebody who has a very big following in the community and has very, very deep roots within the community. And I guess the other question about measurement, I think it really comes from the top. The problem that we have is a lot to do with GDP and a lot to do with how the current government won its mandate with regards to economic growth being like this kind of be-all and end-all, and now we have growth plans. But actually, what about the well-being economy that my esteemed colleague was talking about? Perhaps if we measured different things, success might be more sustainable and might look different and might work better for communities and for the environment.
Frank, I happen to agree with GDP. It's a one-channel measure, isn't it? I'm going to have to stop because the chair will start giving me sideways looks after that. Thank you,
I already have started to do that. So the next question is from Assembly Member Baker.
Thanks, Chair. So my question is about, I'm going to aim it initially at Chrissy and Sarah, and I'm looking at the sort of lower income businesses and low cost workspace that is often valued by communities, and for instance in markets and railway arches that provide those spaces for potential community things that the community value. So how much do you think, to what extent do the planning policies in London recognise the social and economic and environmental value of those sort of spaces?
I don't mind. I feel like I've just said, so you go.
You have sort of,
sorry.
You segued wonderfully into it. So yes, please don't feel, if you think you've said it, though, please don't feel you need to add any additional.
So just to repeat the question, it was about how are these spaces valued in existing
in our planning policies. So specifically, does the planning process value those sort of spaces where we might have businesses and places?
They don't value them the way communities value them.
Yeah.
And I think that is a massive that is a massive issue that probably needs to be addressed, not only in policy, but I guess in this conversation through policy. There was a member of the Brixton campaign that, when talking about these spaces, said, they're not just economic spaces. And I think that planning policy tends to look at them as predominantly economic spaces. And that valuation, which is a decision, it is a political decision, is going to already predispose you to ignoring some of the other things that are happening in these spaces, to the informal community networks that are able to form there, to their contribution to whether it's civic engagement or community engagement, to the ways in which they make communities safer, the ways in which they facilitate belonging, which I know was something that was brought up in the previous panel as well. So I think, and I think that kind of the way that they're spoken about within policy is maybe at the moment is a little bit of a warning when writing policies around social value is, are you taking a term and are you sanitizing it so that it doesn't actually achieve what you want to do because it sounds good? Are you co-opting the term? Are you co-opting the way that it's used in the community to then continue to facilitate development that's ultimately speculative and displaces the people who are already there? And I think that there's a lot of fear around adding terms like social value to policy if it's not kind of made with kind of awareness of that process. It's a little bit of a buzzy word, and that doesn't mean that it doesn't deserve to be, but it should serve as a warning that the actual, I think, effectiveness of any policy around it is going to be impacted by the way in which people in positions of power and people making decisions are going to choose to apply it.
Thanks. Yeah, sure. And then I'll come to you, Stephen, sorry.
Just with regards to railway arches that are currently owned by the state, the ones that are left that are currently owned by the state and owned by the Greater London Authority or by TfL and Places for London, I would say that the current planning policy does not protect these spaces because, again, Len Maloney, who's one of our members from JC Motors, fits the criteria within the current London plan for affordable workspace. But as far as I know, as far as I understand, there currently is no affordable workspace policy within Places for London. There's a sustainability strategy, which is becoming live as I speak, but we don't yet have something that is termed an affordable rent policy for workspace within that. And so we do rely on the London plan, and the London plan isn't really doing anything. And I think more broadly, big money has all the power. So we could have, all the planning policies that we like, and, even a change of government might not stop communities being bulldozed by big money. And I think the only thing that really would stop it is with more risk around community ownership of land and buildings. And if local government was more prepared to facilitate, community-led regeneration in that way.
Yeah. Thanks. As you can understand, because we're the planning committee, we are going to try and work out what can be done through the planning system. But just to reflect back, are you sort of saying in terms of railway arches that there may be sort of hooks in the planning process that something could be done, but actually in terms of the implementation in this example through Places for London, they're not sort of following through on the spirit of that part of the planning?
It doesn't have any sense of accountability. There's no teeth in it. Mm-hmm. So there's no reason in there as it stands for Places for London to be accountable to that part of the policy in the London plan, which says that small businesses with strong links to the community and to local colleges and schools providing apprenticeships, which Len has done absolutely brilliantly for a huge amount of years, particularly towards communities that are disadvantaged and racialised. and for young people that have special educational needs. You know, there are hundreds of people who will quote and attest to the enormous service that he's given to Hackney, which is also one of the most deprived boroughs in London. So I think it demonstrates very clearly in a very clear example how it doesn't really work.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. Stephen, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. By the way, I think you absolutely have to define and measure social value, but happy to share my views about why I think that's the case, and possibly deferring to my panel here. To your question, we don't have any railway arches in Islington, but we've absolutely got street markets and licensed pitches, and I think absolutely planning has a part to play. You know, for us, they're a core part of our inclusive economy, and they're really important. I think also, I know you're strictly planning, but actually licensing is an important tool as well, so you can use it progressively. So when I was talking to colleagues, we've looked to, for example, introduce pop-up refugee-owned pitches for care experience, young people, and actually can use licensing in a very progressive way as well. But fundamentally, markets are important, and some of these policy levers can help. We have got, which I'm very happy to talk about, a very comprehensive affordable workspace policy, which can absolutely be secured through planning and through local plans. I'm very happy to talk about that if that's useful at any point.
I'm very interested in that, but the Chair will probably tell me off, but I wonder whether would we be able to have that shared with us? Would that be helpful, that policy? Yeah.
I think to share that with us, I mean, licensing isn't a planning issue, you're quite right.
But they are. You know, two levers.
As someone who used to help run Broadway Market in Hackney, I am very familiar personally with how licensing is critical to the operation of those markets. Back to you, Assembly Member.
Yeah, I'm very happy to. I'll be brief. So Islington's had an affordable workplace policy for several years now, and we re-secured it through our local plan that was adopted last year. Fundamentally, it's about providing affordable, accessible spaces for our local businesses, from sort of entrepreneurial startups through to micro businesses, to grow and then scale up, and it's a key part of our community wealth building policy, and really important to us. And we've secured, I think what I'd humbly suggest is certainly one of the more progressive policies in London, but effectively that secures for all commercial developments 10% of the uplifted space as affordable workspace in perpetuity. What that means in practice is that we would take that 10% of space, 1,000 square feet, effectively at a peppercorn rent. We then negotiate and we try to dampen down service charges and other things that create barriers to access, business rates and all that sort of stuff. But effectively we have that space in perpetuity to be used for affordable workspaces. We won't have time today, but we then operate those spaces either through third-party operators or ourselves, but fundamentally that's providing in Islington what is typically unaffordable space and a huge barrier to our businesses growing to give them space, and it's working. And we have 7 spaces that are live, and we have several thousand square metres, so a lot of space that's either secured or is in pipeline scheme development. So we will have tens of thousands of square metres of space if all of those developments in our pipeline go through. So that makes a huge difference to our local business community.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And just a quick clarification on that: is that primarily done through development, so it's new spaces, or do you apply that affordable workspace policy to existing business spaces that might be currently low cost, so protecting them effectively? Yeah,
so we do both. So the primary focus is to secure through Section 106 agreements, and we typically secure that space by definition in new or expanded commercial spaces. But in our policy, there are options for effectively an off-site contribution. So we expect and want to secure it in the space, but there can be reasons why it's better to take effectively a cash contribution, and then we can use that then to create spaces elsewhere, for example, to take leases on buildings or to make capital investments in other spaces to allow them to expand. So a bit of both.
Thanks. That's helpful. Bryce, did you want to come in?
Thank you. So I just wanted to kind of follow on from that. So your original question was about planning policies and to what extent they work well. I mean, I think the answer is there are better planning policies and worse planning policies across London. I think my colleague at Islington has identified an example of a good planning policy. Some local plans are more local than others. I would just say that delivering that kind of policy does have resource implications for local authorities, and there is a lot of work that needs to go behind that. And if you've got 33 local authorities across London kind of doing their own but separate approach, it is a challenge. We're looking to do something similar at Haringey.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. That's really helpful. And I'm going to return to... so I'm going to ask Nicholas about the work of the London's Market Board, if that's okay, and how that work aims to recognise and protect the social value delivered by council-run markets in London.
So back in 2019, in the first iterations of the London Markets Board, much work was done in that guise, and a report or a toolkit was created called Evidencing and Capturing Social Value, which was supported by the national body and has been multiplied nationally and internationally to kind of recognise social value. That work has followed up more recently with different interactions with government, with the different departments that have evolved over the number of years, from DCLG to housing, etc. I'm not quite sure where we're at these days, but civil servants at that level are interested in the social value mechanisms that operate within markets and how we instill best practice amongst our colleagues within London and across the UK and Ireland and Northern Ireland, so that we kind of instill the fact that markets are the heart of the community assets, community places of interaction and ownership, so that the social kind of, to go to the point of the previous panel, the social justice in terms of that level playing field of access to information and stuff happens. And recently the national body collated information across the country in terms of what different markets are doing, from having GPs come out onto markets and actually measure blood pressure, and they were at Portobello and actually identified 2 people who needed to go to accident emergency there and then because their blood pressure was through the roof. 2 other kind of interactions from the standard anti-smoking campaigns, fostering, etc. So all of these things have evolved from the London Markets Board work. Again, it's another body, the London Markets Board, that lacks resource to kind of push out the message further. It is trying to preach to the different boroughs in terms of taking that forward, and each borough has its own inclination on how it treats its street trading and markets. And then we also have the fact that within the boroughs we have the private operators and you have the community interest groups. So there's a lot of people to corral to kind of sell the same message in terms of creating that mass, that critical mass which serves the community. So that's where the London Markets Board is at. We've yet to see, with the change of government, where the London Markets Board is going to position itself going forward.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Back to you, Chair.
Sorry, Assembly Member Garbett, please.
Thank you, and thank you all for your contributions and for coming to speak to us. I feel very, like the rest of the committee, feel very strongly about this area. I've got a couple of different questions, but so the first headline question is, what more could the Mayor be doing to recognise and protect social value delivered by council-run markets in London? I might start with Nick and then go to Sarah. Thanks.
Well, that's been debated quite strongly in the London Markets Board and amongst the Association of London Markets, which is a subsidiary body, and also the benchmarking group in terms of different kind of things that could be supported. One of those things may well be a look at the legislation and supporting change in the legislation. The London Local Authorities Act is set up in 1990, has had various iterations, and perhaps it needs a refresh, which can take on the parts of community benefit, community value, in terms of having that as a part of its story, as part of its central kind of manifest. The other kind of things that the Mayor's office could be doing in that vein is also in terms of protecting, going back to planning, protecting storage space for markets, because whilst we talk about actual work zones, etc., markets need storage, because otherwise you have additional white vans bombing up and down London at 20 miles an hour, adding to the traffic issues that already exist. So one of the things that has happened under planning policy and the local development framework within Kensington and Chelsea is a stipulation that all storage units that are operated by the council will be protected. So there is not an opportunity for other colleagues in the town hall to go, perhaps we could release these and take the cash benefit and get on with life. It's a case of, no, we realise that this is a central part of the market and needs to be in place. And actually, we're looking to expand the offer in that way. So there is a need to realise that whilst we have these needs for everything, there is a place for everything, and there needs to be a balanced approach. That's the central thing.
So I actually want to share some comments from one of the coalition members from Shepherd's Bush Market, which is currently under threat of demolition and pretty significant displacement of many of the traders there. So fundamentally, I think a big point of concern for a lot of people is leases. So traders should be at market should all be protected under the should all have protective leases with all the stipulations under the 1954 Act. And I think that is really, really important. When you have traders that don't have protected leases, they are significantly more vulnerable, and their rights in transition become significantly more at risk. That there should be assessment and protection of existing social value prior to giving consent. It needs to be an explicit material consideration. And because at the moment nothing regarding social value is enforceable or changeable legally. It should be, sorry. Yeah, I mean, those are, I think, of the notes I have, those are kind of two of the main things. But I think, as well, the mayor and the GLA need to really kind of ask who the plans and the policy that they're writing are for. Is it to facilitate development? Is it for the developers? In which case, as another coalition member mentioned, it's a developer's plan. If it's a London plan, it's for the people who are already in the city, and is the policy being put in place to protect the people that are already there? If it's not, then it's not effective, and more can be done.
Thank you. I just want to pick up on something you said earlier about the importance of markets being for low-income, racialised and minoritized communities, and I just wondered if you think that protecting, like how social value could be considered for existing markets, but thinking of it more as an equalities issue, and if we could think of it in planning more like that.
I mean, I think fundamentally, the kind of challenges facing markets and retail spaces, and specifically those that support diverse low-income and working-class communities, is an equalities issue. I think that maybe equalities frameworks aren't strong enough when it comes to protecting these spaces for people, and that's probably something else that needs to be looked into. You know, the social justice, which was brought up last panel, has to be non-negotiable. You know, for a lot of communities, especially when there's large immigrant communities that are using these markets, are providing people with important social services and goods that they can't access elsewhere, and that are fundamental to their sense of belonging and to their participation in life in London. And that needs to be protected. That is often organically formed, so not something that can be necessarily facilitated through development, especially if those communities are being left behind. So, yeah, I mean, you know, these are really important spaces and are maybe most important in many cases to communities that are already being pretty systematically negatively impacted by policies and by planning.
Thank you. That's really important to hear. And then, Chrissy, I just wanted to come to you briefly on how could Places for London better recognise and protect the businesses that run in the arches? I know you've talked before about kind of more community ownership of those spaces, or, yeah, just how that could run in a better way.
So much of what you said is relevant in terms of the spaces that are members of the Guild who are also tenants of Places for London. So Trip Space Yoga and Dance, for example, work with 5 different elder groups from global majority backgrounds, doing a lot of prescription work, making sure these elders are healthy and moving and connected. And obviously Len Maloney himself is from a global majority background, and as a business leader it's really important for other young people who are walking the streets and, you know, walking past his garage to see themselves reflected in positions of leadership, you know, in ways that are accessible to them. And, you know, obviously there's a plethora of other ways as well. But I guess for me, the moment is right. We've got a new government. You know, Keir Starmer said a Britain that belongs to you 11 times during his speech to party conference. In the King's speech, we had, you know, stuff about strengthening the community right to buy, with new powers for communities to take assets into ownership. And now we have the growth plan, which, you know, according to 20%, or just over 20% of the people surveyed said that London's economy isn't fair. And also other things that are feeding into that growth plan is social value, is community ownership of assets, and is our manifesto, you know, which is basically 400 small independent businesses, socially trading organisations, you know, all saying with one voice. You've got policy at the top, you've got the ground at the bottom, and we're all saying the same thing. So I would say to Places for London now is like, here is your opportunity to be brave and actually fulfil the mandate of the people and of the state, and create something that is going to be sustainable forever. And also, you know, I think perhaps there is a bit of prejudice around certain types of business and, you know, what things should look like on property portfolios. But I think when you have an affordable rent, that is permanently affordable, you then have flexibility. You then have the opportunity to imagine how you can work with the community, especially with community land trusts, because they are owned by the community. So the community can really just go wild, you know, around what they can do in that space and how they can really support the community to thrive. But at the moment, you know, not only well-being, but quite frankly, growth, which is, you know, the word of the hour politically, is being stifled by the state, and it doesn't have to be.
Thank you. Just to quickly follow up, I mean, I think the London Growth Plan, if it's going to be truly inclusive, needs to talk about markets, I think would be my view. And I think just building quickly on what Sarah said, markets are a great and relatively low barrier to entry to build your business. And actually, you know, we have, there's too much disproportionality in our startups across London, and actually it does breed diversity. So it's a great place to grow your business, and it should be part of any inclusive growth plan for London. So that would be my 2 pence.
Very helpful contribution, thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Assembly Member Lord Bailey is next, please.
Thank you. I'm going to focus on Stephen and Bryce in the beginning with this question. How do you maximise the social value in the planning and regeneration? How do you maximise social value in planning and regeneration? And how do you measure the impact on local community? Because I think it's easy to say social value, which is a term I think is terrible, by the way. And because it means so many different things to so many different people, and we are talking about public money in many cases, it does need to be quantified so somebody can justify the spend. So how can we measure it, which is very important, and how can we lock it into the planning and regeneration, not only the system, but just the mindset when you're moving forward? And I have a deeper question I'll ask, maybe other members of the panel want to come in. We talk about markets. I grew up next to Shepherd's Bush Market and Portobello Market, and are they at least economically viable? Because I think there's a much stronger argument if they're economically viable. But let me start with Stephen and Bryce first.
Thank you. So in Islington, I mean, we agree with all you're saying. You have to define it, you have to measure it, and you have to secure it. So the way we do that through our local plan is through clear policies, first of all. So, you know, in no particular order, our affordable housing policies, our affordable workspace policy. We have a range of expectations around contributions around things like skills and employment, sustainability. So you have to define it very clearly, very explicitly in planning policy, and then you, as I said earlier on to one of your colleagues, you need to secure it through development agreements and developer obligations with, for example, take skills and employment. So we will always secure explicitly detail, for example, around apprenticeships, so the number, the type, the nature in terms of different skills. So, for example, in Islington, one of our biggest developments of what was the old Holloway prison site, we've secured around 60 apprenticeships linked to a Green Skills Academy and also focused on female apprenticeships given the legacy of the prison. So you can absolutely define and secure social value, for example, in that case, in creating more apprenticeships for local people through the planning process. I think the other thing I'd say is that, going back to the earlier conversation, for me, the key part of the definition of social value is additionality. So it can't. So, for example, a developer making, you know, their statutory requirement to pay CIL is not social value. That's what we expect to do. Our developers delivering policy requirements in Islington is not social value. It has to be on top of and in addition to anything that we expect them to do through law or through policy. So those would be my sort of opening comments.
Thank you. Can I come to Bryce with how do we maximise the social value in the planning system, and any comments you might have on measuring it?
Yep, thank you. So, I mean, in planning policy terms, our primary tool is the local plan. So there's a couple of key things a local plan can do to be successful in this arena. The first thing is that it has to set out a ambitious vision and strategy for the future of the borough that all stakeholders, including the development community, can buy into. So I think that's the starting point, being clear about what you want. And in that connection, I think it is important to define what we're seeking. In Haringey, we're not specifically seeking social value. We've wrapped it up into a broader placemaking aspiration. And we have spent a long time trying to figure out what we mean by placemaking so that we can accurately articulate that to everyone involved. So that's the starting point, having a vision. The second key thing is your planning policies. So what can your planning policies do to maximise social value? I guess there's a couple of things I would mention here, talking about maximising. So to be successful, a planning policy has to give a clear indication to a person submitting an application as to what the council wants, the community wants, and it also has to give a clear signal to the decision maker, who may be a planning committee or might be an officer on delegated powers. It needs to give a clear signal as to what they should be granting or what they should be refusing. So it needs to be clear what the council wants in its area. So that's the starting point. In terms of policies, they generally go in one of two directions. You can set a floor for what you want. So a couple of examples of that would be the urban greening factor in the London plan, or the government's new flagship policy around biodiversity net gain. In that case, they've decided that it's better to have a 10% floor rather than have a higher ceiling that they can't pin down. You can choose to have a ceiling around maximising social value, but there are downsides to that. Previously, the London plan set a ceiling for affordable housing. It talked about delivering the maximum reasonable amount of affordable housing. The GLA has actually decided that a better approach for affordable housing in London is to set a floor, which in London is a threshold approach to affordable housing because that works better. So you just need to think very carefully about whether you set a ceiling or a floor.
Okay. And I asked a wide question about Shepherd's Bush Market because I can tell you of great social value. My mum will be absolutely devastated if it goes anywhere. But there is the tension of they're talking about housing, and if it's not standing on its own 2 feet, where do we go from there?
Well, it is going somewhere.
Good.
Because the mayor has just approved via the call-in process. So it will be going somewhere. Kind of two things I think worth saying. The first is you speak about additionality. A net calculation is unacceptable. And I think that that's something that's really, really important. If you are evaluating what the social value is to communities that are there already, and you are giving that a number, and then you are allowing the developer to destroy that, but then provide a net additional, that is not okay, because you have just displaced that entire community. in terms of viability, I mean, viability is a very slippery word, I think. Are you looking at circular economies? Are you looking at the ways in which local markets are supporting local people who are paying local taxes? Or are you looking at the way in which these spaces are contributing to some arbitrary GDP calculation that isn't actually materially felt by the people who are on the ground using the market? Markets are employing local people. They're keeping money in local spaces. They are not maybe connected as immediately or as substantially to the global economy in the way other spaces are, but they are serving very important purposes. And there is a value judgment that is made about what economies are more important for these spaces to be contributing to, and that comes down to policy. So are you allowing them to not be making, in the grand scheme of things, as much profit, understanding that they are supporting local needs and local spaces to a better extent, or are you demanding that they meet profit thresholds that actually are less relevant to the people who are using them?
I take your point, and the conversation that's generated in my head, I think we'll have to take offline, because there is a risk that you ghettoise people. Your local market might be great, I might working there, but doing something else might expose me to a wider situation. But the chair is looking at me sideways. You and I will have that conversation, because I don't have a yes or a no on that, but I'm trying to figure that out for myself, if you see what I mean. Thank you.
Yeah, again. Thank you. The next question comes from Assembly Member Small Edwards.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you everyone for your contributions and for coming today. My question is about the Mayor and how he could better support local councils to deliver social value through planning and regeneration. So maybe I'll come to the representatives for the councils first.
A couple of things the Mayor can do to support particular local planning authorities. So local plans need to be in general conformity with the London plan. So there is something in this about the London plan setting, and it is a strategic plan, setting out a clear message that local authorities through the local plan should be seeking to deliver or maximise social value. Ideally, there will be more detailed policies behind that. I always think if it's worth doing across the whole of London, it's worth doing by the GLA and by doing well. So the threshold approach to affordable housing is a really good example. Urban greening factor is another example. If you leave local authorities to their own, then they don't often, in a lot of cases, have the resources to really excel in these areas. In most cases, local authorities can choose to excel in a couple of areas of their local plans. It's very difficult to be spectacular across the board, so you have to think very carefully about what you can and can't do. The position at local authorities in terms of local plan teams across London is pretty stark in terms of having minimal resource. There was a survey of the RTPI this week where the majority of planners said they are struggling to do even the bare statutory minimum. So we have to be conscious about what local plan authorities, what the boroughs can do themselves, and where the GLA can really provide some kind of high-level support to that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I agree with Bryce that it's there's probably some knowledge sharing, information sharing. I mean, half of me thinks sort of don't get in the way would be one example, but actually there is good practice, and the ability to share that is always challenging. And I think, sort of building on Bryce's point, I think there are London-wide messages to developers. I mean, most of the developers we work with get social value and want to do it, and it's not token, and it's a serious contribution. That's our experience. But we're really clear that that's important to us, and maybe sometimes the clarity then gets the seriousness. So I think that being echoed across London, I think is helpful, that it's real, can make a difference to local communities, and, as in your deliberations, that the planning policy and the process of development is a hugely important enabler to secure more social value. So I think that the idea of sharing good practice, both upwards and downwards, is important, and I think echoing the seriousness, I guess, of what we're trying to do, as public policy makers generally, to make, as the panel said, to make a difference ultimately to our local communities.
If I might just make one further point in addition to that. So London Plan is a very long document for a strategic document with, I think, over 100 policies. So we do need to think very carefully about managing the size of that document so it can have maximum impact. A new social value approach or a new emphasis on it can't just be one additional policy tagged onto a long list of additional policies. It really has to be, as it has to be in local plans, completely embedded. One of the areas where good growth fell short, I think, in the London Plan examination was that it didn't tie down exactly what good growth was in policy terms. So it was more of a kind of general, we'd like this. So it didn't make the kind of policy cut for the document. Very valuable, but think about how it can make the cut in the future so it has real bite in planning decisions.
No other contributions on that? Oh, Sarah?
Just adding to that, I think that there's a lot of important work to be done about the ways in which any new social value policy might come into tension with existing opportunity area policies, that certain levels of intensification of development and maybe relying pretty substantially on outside developers to be delivering that is going to come at the risk of social value of the places that are being developed and that are earmarked as opportunity areas.
Thank you very much. And you mentioned about having London Plan to have that more strategic look London-wide. Are there quite significant discrepancies between boroughs in terms of how social values looked at currently? And would kind of having something definitive in the London Plan potentially address that?
I mean, from my perspective, yes, I think so, and part of that is because of the nature of the local planning policy. You know, as Bryce said, they are fundamentally designed to, the clues in the title really, to reflect local communities. So I think differentiation is absolutely right and proper, but I would suggest that this is an important thing that should be drawn up and, as we've talked earlier on, to share some of the good practice. I think there are differences, which is important and right, but maybe it's my perspective, but some of the stuff we're talking about today feels important for all Londoners. So I think there are stuff that maybe can be sort of extrapolated up into, as Bryce said, but I think it's important if it does go in, then it needs to have teeth and weight and needs to, I would come back to ultimately things that through the planning process we can secure through development. That has to be the key test.
And Bryce, has Haringey linked social value and rent levels in terms of recognising the contribution of certain small businesses?
So Haringey doesn't, at an organisational level, currently have an agreed definition of social value. It's used in a more limited sense to refer only to procurement. As part of this new placemaking framework, which we're building our new local plan around, we're trying to build in a kind of wider embodiment of social value. As part of that, we are thinking very carefully about rent levels, applied to affordable housing, where we know there's significant challenges, and also applied to affordable workspace. And we'll be looking to go in a similar direction to Islington in terms of protecting affordable workspace firstly, but also looking to provide more in the future, having regard to the demand for it across London.
Yeah, and I think affordable workspace is important, and council develop schemes as well. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you.
If I can ask a sort of general, perhaps it's not that general a question, but we've seen, over the years, we've seen some threats to community organisations, community functions. I'm familiar with Queen's Market back in 2010. I was on the Assembly then when that was overturned, and there was Ward's Corner, of course, which is still very much under threat. We've got Shepherd's Market now closing, and Len Maloney, I remember from my days in Hackney what needs to be present? What policy needs to be written that would, for example, force the Mayor of London to not take the decision that he made with regard to Shepherd's Bush Market? What was the policy in there that was missing that would have protected them? That's. I know this is a very hypothetical question because I'm asking you to, invent the past. But it's just to give us an idea of how the planning policy can protect those things, what would that line in the London plan look like for him to have made a different decision?
To be entirely honest with you, I don't know if I'm familiar enough with the policies that are there for me to answer that responsibly. I'm sure that other members of the coalition and maybe Loud and Elephant will, as part of kind of a larger submission of evidence, possibly comment on that. I do think it does come down to priorities, and that is, I guess that can be added to policy, but also isn't necessarily doesn't necessarily need to be added to policy. I think, in the case of Shepherd's Market, it's siding with an international developer that is building largely luxury accommodation and workspace, and that is a value judgment ultimately. So I guess the question there is just, are you, back to what I said before, are you facilitating, are you making it easy for developers to be doing this, or are you going to make them jump through hoops to protect communities? And is your priority, and is the priority in policy, keeping communities in place? Or is it building a London that's courting outside communities or other communities or new communities, and are you building infrastructures to support those new communities instead of kind of reinvesting and maintaining those that already exist?
Mr. Biggs, yes.
I mean, just quickly, and Bryce may want to comment, but perhaps less planning policy, but the immediate response to your question feels like site allocations as well through local planning policy. So I can't obviously comment on Shepherd's Bush Market, but and Bryce will have the same. Going through a local planning process, the process of site allocating, is crucially important, and thinking about what you're trying to achieve in your local place. So that feels like, and certainly we use it to protect, whether it's protecting development for residential, protecting development for some of our commercial areas, and I don't see any reason why. I mean, we don't. Most of ours are street markets, so we don't have a similar sort of infrastructure as some other parts of London. But site allocations feels like, I think, part of the way that you could secure and protect some of these areas.
And Ms. Nicholson.
Yeah, I think I would really strongly agree with that. With regards to the Places for London estate, I think it'd be really interesting to look at the arches in terms of, how many businesses within those arches are female-led, are black-owned, are socially trading organisations, are foundational organisations, and think through, how can we retain that value that's been built up through the blood, sweat and tears of local people over any number of years by offsetting the value that they're providing against the rent. I do think rent reductions is really, really key here. And if we do want to keep up with national policy and indeed global policy, the UN recently passed a resolution with their Pact for the Future about the Beyond GDP movement. So again, it's like we're not saying GDP is completely redundant, but it's a very old, out of date measurement, and there needs to be new ways of looking at value. And so rent being offset within a policy such as a public landlord, as Places for London, would be fantastic.
Thank you. Oh yes, Ms. Goldstein.
I think one thing that maybe needs to be added in policy is something around community opposition to development. So if there is, and this also, and I think this was an issue within Shepherd's Bush about kind of questions about who was representative of the traders and who was representative of the community. But I do think that there need to be greater opportunities and maybe greater emphasis on community opposition to development. That if the community voice is saying that they don't want this there, that should have more weight than, purported viability and profitability of these larger developments.
It's about weight. Thank you. Mr. Cassage.
Just in relation to Shepherd's Bush, which I walked through as a kid for many years, and know the story there very well. It's quite ironic that the private market behind is owned by the Portobello Group, and they're sitting quietly on the side, seeing what develops for the future. In relation to the Shepherd's Bush market kind of entity, you're right, it's a case of who was protesting. But what I would say is that if traders and it is about the consultation and whether they're taken on the journey. It's a case of if the traders are up for the development in terms of improving their market, then that should be supported. And hopefully the community is supporting the traders. But that's all subject to how the land lies. The big white elephant of Shepherd's Bush, of course, is Westfield and its impact within the local area on high streets and on markets around the place. When Westfield first arrived, it actually did a cheeky stunt of doing a charity stand on Portobello with D.H. Evans, supposedly a charity stand to support a local charity, but in fact it was a promotional stand for D.H. Evans in Westfield. So it's amazing the stunts that get pulled by the big boys, and it's even been played through inviting Portobello to come and sit within Westfield itself, and you'll see these days artisanal markets actually being facilitated as concessions within Westfield. But Westfield arrived due to, going back to your original points about local politics. Local politicians agreed to it, and that's had an impact on the Shepherd's Bush factor. When Foxtons arrived in Shepherd's Bush and we have a 5-star hotel on Shepherd's Bush Green, you kind of sit there and go, okay, Shepherd's Bush has evolved, but has it changed? It's a very interesting question to kind of sit in terms of the local community. If you go down the Uxbridge Road, it is an ethnic migrant community that's being supported. Shepherd's Bush Market sits at the bottom of that. Goldhawk Road, lesser so, but Uxbridge Road is a very vibrant place and supports a certain community and does it very well. So how does the evolution of local politics work with that? And it comes back to the change of politics within Hammersmith and Fulham had a massive impact on that process. So the Shepherd's Bush story is an interesting one, and back to Lord Bailey's point about economic viability, Portobello and Shepherd's Bush are a bit like chalk and cheese in many respects, because we're a council-run operation, that's a private market. So our needs are subtly different. We can only make enough money to cover our costs, while Shepherd's Bush Market is there to make a profit for its shareholders. So that's the problem with private enterprise coming into market spaces, because what you'll notice is that rents are, you can have a stall on Portobello Road for £47 a week, as long as you get in at the right time. So a 6-day trader can operate for that price, while on a private setup, you're talking about £40 to £50 per day as a minimum. So these kind of comparisons need to be done in such a way that it recognises what you're playing with, because the whole evolution of markets, and I would say, whilst we're talking on that fact, is the evolution of street food markets and that massive explosion of that, which is catering to massive parts of the London world, shall we say, and that includes visitors and shoppers and tourists. But is it actually supporting local community markets? Is it supporting the local community? Recently we launched World's End Community Market down in Riverside in Chelsea, which was funded by Public Health to bring the market and affordable items to the local community, and offering a platform for local cooperation, local engagement with the health sector, with the different services of the council, to have a more natural setting, because people aren't interested in walking into a council building. So we brought the services to the people. So that community market, the term community market is a step change that we've decided to do there, supporting the fact that we see a social value in markets. However, we need to make a step change and go to the people rather than the people coming to us.
Thank you. Mr. Tubble.
Just to come back to your original question, which is around what could the London plan do to provide more support through its planning policies for markets and railway arches. Thinking narrowly as a planner, there has to be somewhere where the London plan sets out express support for the protection and enhancement of existing markets and railway arches for the reason that they are of strategic importance to London, and there needs to be evidence to underpin that. You could then take the option of either drawing a line around them at a London plan level, as you do for some things in London, like strategic industrial locations, or you can set a requirement for local authorities to put a line around these things on a map and provide proactive, positive policies to protect them. So that's what you can do in a planning policy sense. That works better for permanent markets. So planning policy is about managing land use and managing new development buildings. So there's only a limited sphere in which we can have an impact, but that is something that you could do to make a material impact on that.
And you've given us some ideas there, Mr. Tuball, about how we approach the London plan, because that, of course, now we've started to consider that. I think we've now reached the end of our discussion, and I'd just like to thank everyone for coming today. It's been extremely useful. You're free to leave, but before we do, we've just got to do a couple more items. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion? On the work programme, can I ask the committee to note the work programme for the 24-25 Assembly here? And the next meeting, the Planning and Regeneration Committee, will take place on the 26th of November 2024 at 10 a.m. in the Chamber. I have no urgent business, which concludes today's meeting. Thank you very much, everyone.
From City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast